Very interesting and good. Okay, I see we've pretty much got a full house now. That's really great to see people here. Today's program is being brought to you by Task Force on the Americas, which has been around since 1985, doing work, especially starting off around Central America, and but then expanding throughout the Caribbean and Latin America. Our next speaker is Dan Kovalik. Dan is a labor and human rights lawyer. He's also the attorney for the Colombian President Gustavo Petro, and he's the author of numerous books, one of which Dan has some copies of here, The Plot to Overthrow Venezuela. It's a very good book. I've read it and highly recommend it. So please welcome Dan Kovalik.
Thank you very much. So nice to see everyone out here on a beautiful day in the Bay Area. By the way, the book that's available, all the proceeds go to the Cuban project that we're supporting today. So, and I'm happy to sign it for you. I just wanted to build on one thing that was mentioned before, and that's the Caracazo in 1989. I always like to point that out as kind of a very good example of how Western propaganda works. So the Caracazo was an uprising in Caracas against the newly elected president, who had promised during his campaign that he would not give in to IMF austerity measures. And then when he was elected and became president, the first thing he did was to give in to IMF austerity measures, which led to an increase in fuel prices and therefore transportation prices and in the products of other goods. And finally, the people of Caracas, who had already been suffering economically, had had enough, and so there were protests in the city. And the government cracked down very violently. And it's not known how many people were killed, because many people were disappeared, but it's estimated that up to 3,000 people might have been killed during that uprising. Now, the interesting part of this is that this is an incident that almost no one in the United States knows about. It didn't get any press, hardly, in the United States, and certainly it's not commemorated as some big event. And what I compare that to is something else that happened in 1989, and that was the so-called Tiananmen Square massacre in China. And every day, in the 25th anniversary of that, there's always, every paper in the Time magazine, they all have stories on it. When it was happening, they were giving day-to-day blow-by-blow coverage, if you recall that. You could not ignore what was happening there. Now, I'm not going to get into what happened in Tiananmen Square or what did not, because there's a lot of misinformation on what happened. I think the narrative is not true, what we're told. But again, that's not really important for this, the point I'm trying to make. But even if you accept the Western narrative of what happened in Tiananmen Square, it's estimated that at most 3,000 people were killed around the Tiananmen Square massacre. And that's in a country of 1 billion people, as opposed to Venezuela, that at that time had anywhere between 25 and 30 million. So as a proportion of the population, the Caracazo was much more significant. And in China, I think it's, conceded that what happened as a result of the so-called Tiananmen Square massacre, really nothing in terms of what was happening in China. The government survived, and the policies of China continued. So, as a historic event, it's not as significant as what happened in Venezuela, where the Caracazo gave rise to a guy named Hugo Chavez and the Chavista Revolution. And ultimately, Chavez would be elected in 1998. And those events in 1989 really spurred on that movement. So as a historic matter, it's a much more important and significant event, but it's one that almost no American knows about because no one told you about it. And certainly no one reminds you about it every 25 years or whatever. So anyway, I think that's a good example of how propaganda works. Now, with that said, I want to talk about Colombia today, another country that I think most Americans know little to nothing about, right? Most Americans think of it as a place, where cocaine comes from. They know maybe Pablo Escobar. They, Shakira they might know about. And that's about the sum total of what people think about Colombia. But of course, it's such a much richer country in many ways. First of all, and we have a resident bird biologist here, Roger Harris. And Roger, did you know there's more than 2,000 bird species in Colombia, the most in the world of any country? And there are 75 distinct ethnic groups in Colombia, the many indigenous groups. There's a huge Afro-Colombian population. Again, which very few people think about when they think about Colombia. But it's a very rich country in many ways. And to its detriment, it has what is called the resource curse. Because it has so many resources, oil, emeralds, gold, fresh water, others, and once had a very good place to put a canal, till the U.S. stole that, created Panama and stole that. Because of those things, it has been a target of U.S. imperialism for quite a long time, certainly beginning in 1903 with the U.S. supporting these insurgent groups in Panama to break Panama off from what had historically been part of Colombia. And by the way, currently President Petro, who I represent, as was mentioned, when he was senator, I heard him speak, and he said something very profound. He believed that the violence you're seeing in Colombia, that you've seen in Colombia now for over 100 years, he traces back to those events in 1903 with the U.S. support of those insurgent groups to take Panama and the Panama Canal. That's another thing I think Americans don't think a lot about. When you commit these horrible acts of violence, they don't just stop, right? They're not contained. They have unintentional consequences that can last for generations, and that has been true in Colombia. With that, I'm going to start a bit, talk about a few different historical events in Colombia that I think are worth noting. So, over time, U.S. companies in Colombia have played a very treacherous role in addition to the U.S. government and military. One of the most famous events is cataloged in the novel 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and he mentions a banana strike that was met with violence by the army, in which the strikers were murdered and their bodies were shipped away in trains, and the bodies were never seen again. And that is based on a true event that happened in 1928 in the town of Ciénaga, Colombia, in which hundreds of strikers, if not thousands, were killed at the behest of United Fruit Company, which later became Chiquita Banana, which was originally based in Boston. Then it moved to Cincinnati, which is my hometown. And then it moved to North Carolina, and now it finally moved to Ireland because it's continued to support violence in Colombia and continued at times to face some legal consequences here, though not big ones. So the most recent significant one was that Chiquita, a board member of Chiquita, ended up going to the Justice Department under George W. Bush and admitting that Chiquita had been paying the paramilitary death squads $1.7 million between the years 1997 and 2004 and running them 3,000 Kalashnikov rifles. And ultimately, because the board member, who was afraid of himself getting into trouble, that's why he went to the Justice Department, because Chiquita ended up admitting to doing this, they were indicted, but they did settle with the Justice Department. And their incredible punishment was that they were fined $25 million that they were allowed to pay over 5 years. They're allowed to pay in installments. The next time you get a speeding ticket, ask for the Chiquita deal. Ask if you can pay in installments. And no one went to jail. And in fact, the officials who were involved in the scheme, their identities were kept secret from Colombia so that they couldn't go after them. And what resulted from that was, and I talked to Mario Iguaran, who was the Attorney General under President Alvaro Uribe, who was a real right-winger. And his Attorney General himself said, hey, you know, Chiquita claimed that the money was given for protection. That is, that they were basically just paying for the paramilitaries to leave them alone. He said that was not true. He said what they did is they paid for blood. That they paid the paramilitaries to violently displace the people of the Yoruba region from the region so that they could have their banana plantations. Most of these, by the way, were Afro-Colombians. And in the process, thousands of people were killed. And again, they got a $25 million fine for that. The next big event in Colombia that I think is significant, and which hopefully will not repeat itself, though people have fears of that, that is the assassination of presidential candidate Jorge Gaitan in 1948. And he was a left-wing politician. He was running for president. It looked like he was going to win, and he was murdered. And this led to la violencia, to civil unrest in the next several years, which led to the deaths of about 500,000 Colombians. And to this day, we don't know who was behind that killing, though many believe it was the CIA that had just been formed in 1948. And in fact, the documents, which are still classified, are being requested by the Colombian government. When President Petro met with Trump, one of the things they asked for was that those documents be declassified. And hopefully that will be done. And then in 1962, and this is when the modern, I would say the modern U.S. policy towards Colombia is created. John F. Kennedy created something called the National Security Doctrine. And it was a military doctrine towards Latin America. And it was created in response to a few things. One was the Cuban Revolution in 1959, but also to the emergence of liberation theology, a strain of Catholicism that took a preferential treatment for the poor, and they grew out of the Second Vatican Council in 1962. And the goal of the National Security Doctrine, of course, had nothing to do with national security, and everything to do with destroying social movements throughout Latin America, through, amongst other things, the creation of paramilitary death squads. This was a very intentional part of the policy as enunciated by General William Yarborough, who talked about the need to create these quasi-military organizations that could carry out atrocities against labor leaders, priests, indigenous leaders, women's leaders, without that being attributed to the Colombian, or to the government that the U.S. was supporting, or to the U.S. itself. And the first place that the U.S. began this death squad policy was Colombia. Now, this is a policy the U.S. has used many times after, including in Vietnam, famously in El Salvador, and later in Iraq. Right? Remember, the U.S. talked about, even openly talked about, using the Salvador option in Iraq. But it really could have been called the Colombia option, because that was the first place the U.S. began that. And as part of the National Security Doctrine, the U.S. began Plan Lazo in Colombia, which was a plan to destroy what was these autonomous regions in Colombia that had been set up by peasant communities. They were these autonomous peasant communities. And the U.S. And the Colombian elite wanted those destroyed because they didn't want communal property to be held by the poor. They wanted that land for the elite. And so in 1964, the U.S. napalmed parts of Colombia. Did you know that? They used napalm in Colombia to go after these peasant cooperatives and regions. And this led to the creation of the FARC, the main left-wing guerrilla movement, which only disbanded officially in 2016. And the war that began in 1964, which the U.S. really started, would claim the lives of about 450,000 Colombians, and that's on top of the 500,000 that were killed after the murder of Gaitán. Then in the year 2000, William Jefferson Clinton began the so-called Plan Colombia, which was a 10-year, $10 billion military aid policy towards Colombia. Now, the Colombians called it Plan Washington because it was hatched in Washington without Colombian participation. And it was written in English and never even translated into Spanish. It was a policy imposed upon Colombia. And while it was ostensibly given to fight drug trafficking in Colombia, by the end of Plan Colombia, many deaths later, billions of dollars later, the White House quietly admitted not 1 ounce of coca production or cocaine trafficking was stopped as a result. And that's because it wasn't the point. The point, again, as the national security doctrine of 1962 was to destroy the social movements in Colombia, labor movement, indigenous movements, Afro-Colombian movements. 80 Catholic priests were killed during this time, including 3 bishops. That's according to the Colombian Catholic Bishops' Conference. And according to that Colombian Bishops' Conference, they were killed because of their advocacy for the poor. And again, that was the point. And U.S. companies, again, like Chiquita, like Coca-Cola and others, were supportive of the death squads at that time. The other thing that should be noted, again, for those who aren't aware of it, there was this false positive scandal in Colombia, which I think is very important to know about because I think it's emblematic of what the war was about. So the U.S. was really incentivizing the Colombian military to have a body count, to show that they were killing FARC rebels, like they had a body count in Vietnam, very famously. Well, because they weren't killing, for the most part, rebels, but mostly were killing social leaders, they had a problem showing results. So they started this false positive program where they would just go out and they would find young men and they would murder them and they would dress them up like guerrillas and put guns in their hands and take photos and claim that they had killed guerrillas. And the Colombian government would later admit that they did this. They would even, because there's high unemployment in Colombia, they would even have put out job announcements and say, hey, meet at the bus downtown if you want a job. And, if you're between 18 and, 25. And the young men would come and they go on the bus and they'd be taken away and killed. And the Colombian government would admit that around 7,000 young men were killed in this way. And again, all incentivized by the United States. Incredibly then, so there was a peace deal that was agreed to with the FARC in 2016, which has held to some extent, but there's many armed groups now. The problem has metastasized, I would say, and the paramilitaries still exist as well. But incredibly, throughout all this, Gustavo Petro, who, as I said, is my client, he was an M19 guerrilla himself. That was an urban guerrilla movement. He was captured at one point, tortured, ultimately released as part of a peace deal with the M19. He would later become a congressperson, a senator, mayor of Bogota, And finally, he was elected president in 2002, which was an incredible, almost miraculous event, given all this bloodshed and all of the violence against the progressive movements. And he has done his best to change the policies of Colombia, to end the dirty war against the people, to end all the conflict. He's had a plan of so-called total peace, where he's tried to negotiate peace with all the armed groups, which has been successful to some extent and not successful in others. He is very adamant that he wants to end the use of fossil fuels, and that has been, of course, very controversial, not only within Colombia, but vis-a-vis the United States. And he has been an outspoken advocate for Palestine. In fact, he in 2024, and then more firmly in 2025, has ended coal exportation to Israel. At the time he did that, Colombia was providing Israel with about, I think it was something like 50+% of its coal that it needs for its energy production. And so that was a very radical thing, which put Petro at odds with the United States. And this is why Petro ends up being put on this OFAC list, where he's blacklisted economically. All of his accounts were frozen. The accounts of his wife and one of his sons were frozen. By the way, they, you know, when the accounts were frozen, it turned out that his family had a total of $80,000 in the bank. Not a guy who was not exactly getting rich, unlike many politicians in Colombia and the United States. And so he's been an amazing leader, both in Colombia and the world, against all odds, you know, where again his neighbor Nicolas Maduro was kidnapped, and at one point Trump said he would be next. And I think that threat is always there. And now his successor, Ivan Cepeda, who his family had very strong ties with the Communist Party. His father was a communist leader who was assassinated. He's right now ahead in the polls, and the first round of the elections are tomorrow. And he is expected to do very well, to have the highest vote count tomorrow, but probably not enough to win in the first round. So there will be a second round, actually on my birthday, June 21st. And that looks very tight. That looks very tight because the two right-wing candidates, if you add their poll numbers together, they would have more votes than Cepeda in the second round. If it works out that way, right? If that's how people vote, you know, we'll see. But to me, it's one of the most important elections in the world right now. I mean, it really will determine the future of Colombia, which again has been a beachhead of the United States. In fact, it's been called the Israel of South America. And still to this day has at least 7 military bases there of the U.S. By the way, Israel has been very influential in Colombia and has supported the death squads there. In fact, the head of the AUC, the biggest death squad group, a guy named Carlos Castaño, in his memoir said that he owes his life and his country to Israel because they trained and armed the paramilitary death squads. But the hope is that Cepeda could win. The fear is that, well, one, he might not win, but also there's been, great fear that he could be the next Jorge Gaitan, and be killed, And that is always a risk, in a country where when you campaign for president, you have to do so behind, bulletproof glass. So that is what's happening in Colombia. And again, I think it'll be very important for the region to have an independent Colombia with a progressive leader that will not bow to the United States. But that will, you know, will be a struggle, and we'll know after June 21st whether that happens. So Colombia is a country that needs a lot of solidarity. I think it's one that has been largely ignored, again, I think because of really a lack of knowledge that Americans just have about the nature of that country and its importance in the world. But I hope that this was helpful in some regard, and thank you very much.